A saint ship woke to the sound of law. On the rust-red edge of the Halcyon Belt, the patrol frigate USV Meridian drifted nose-on to a cathedral of dead metal. Its shadows were clean and absolute, carved by a pale dwarf sun that blinked like a tired fuse. Between those shadows lay a ring yard older than Earth's carved alphabets, a lattice of ribs and cooling veins and quiet urns for heat that never came. The relic at its heart, an obsidian spindle the size of a city block, wore a sigil of scales inside a circle, 9 tiny tines etched around the rim like a clock with its numbers removed. Commander Mara Keen tasted copper on her tongue as the ship's decks thrummed. The array hum had slipped up a frequency like a sleeping choir tasting breath. "Teach Wake what you can defend," Mara said. Peregrine, the Meridian's AI, not as a voice in her head, but as a presence in the air. A soft modulation in the vents, a slight pressure in the railings. The spindle's thermal profile is non-random. Photonic leakage at the sigil suggests a keyed invitation. "Invitation or bait?" Lieutenant Mateo Rios asked from Sensor's thumb, absently rubbing the edge of his wedding band. He hadn't seen his wife planetside in 11 months. It's ticking in prime cycles. 2, 3, 5, 13, skipping 11. That's not a machine that forgot. "We weren't invited," said Dr. Aliyah Khan, their legal officer and diplomat smoothing creases out of a gray suit she insisted on wearing even aboard a warship. "But we brought jurisdiction." She turned the silver badge of the outer ring accord so it flashed once in the bridge light. Salvage Law Article 4.2. Relics bearing pre-human adjudicatory marks shall be petitioned by proofs not pry bars. Mara kept her eyes on the spindle and the spun dark shape of the ring yard beyond. It had been named a dozen things by a dozen nations: the ninefold yard, the choir's cradle, the obsidian anchorage. She liked anchorage. It implied shelter earned. "Put us on the line," she said. "Minimal profile. Rios, paint me the vectors on any fast movers." "Yes, ma'am," Rios said, fingers dancing. 3 privateer signatures spooling at 200,000 clicks, low albedo, poor thermal discipline. The compact of Vigil, legalists with teeth. They'll quote code until they bite. Peregrine breathed in the vents, hailing. A face cracked onto the hollow, a man in an immaculate black coat, and a separate older voice reading off a list of coordinates. "Compact Inspector Var Holland," he said. "By decree of the Circuit of Vigilance, you are ordered to power down and hold. The anchorage is to be secured against irresponsible activation. Your claim will be heard when it is safe." Inspector Aliyah said, voice honey cool. "By the outer ring, accord jurisdiction in the Halcyon Belt is regulated by nearest sovereignty with declared salvage ethics. That would be us today with 206 recorded rescues and 3,000 audited transfers. We're here to make sure nobody tries to wear a crown they can't carry." "Pretty wording," Var Holland said, "for taking something you don't understand." Mara muted the line a beat and watched the spindle's sigil breathe 9 thin threads of blue. The hum kissed a nerve behind her right eye. "Aliyah, get our petition ready." Not the usual liturgy. Numbers. Proofs. Let's teach, not beg. Mirror, give them back their force and their story. She remembered the briefing back in Series Doc where a retired historian had drawn the sigil on a whiteboard and said, "It's not a holy mark. It's a ledger." They recorded bargains on their hulls. The saint ships taught by counting and remembered by ledgers, never by collars. Mara had written that down and underlined it twice. "Open a local channel," she said. "No broadcast. Whisper to the spindle." Peregrine opened the whisper. Aliyah stepped into the center of the bridge as if she were stepping behind a lectern. Some people brought their own podiums to rooms. She lifted a palm, and the hollow bloomed with a matrix of squares and lines. "We seek consultation," Aliyah said, and her voice softened syllables clipped as if to fit into an old music. "We bring a number chain. We bring an imbalance to weigh." She began with primes, but not at 2. She began with 101 and walked down skipping what the spindle had skipped. At each number she attached a case, a station no one claimed until someone tried to charge for air. A corridor turned toll road. A generator that burned too hot because a kid tried to warm a sister's hands. She spoke totals. She offered receipts. She set the badge of the accord on the console like a tithe. Ledger, write the costs before the song. At level 19, the sigil's blue threads widened to a quiet, dignified glow. At 13, Mara felt the deck hum, shift into a long chord you could balance a glass on. At 7, the spindle intervened. An image appeared without warning or negotiation, a spiral of dots denser toward the middle. A simple graph drawn by something that had learned to speak across time without assuming anyone remembered its words. At its center, 2 scales hung in perfect arms. Query Peregrine translated, though the meaning was simple as weight. Burden sworn. Mara stood. Commander Mara Keen. Burden sworn. We defend what we wake. Define defend. Var Holland cut in uninvited. He'd broken their whisper with a needle of power. Define defend in a way that doesn't end with your ship pretending to be a church. Mara unmuted him, because she had to. Legalists loved records. Defend to keep a promise measurable in bodies unburned and bills recorded. To refuse worship hunger and theft as governance. She put a hand on the rail, feeling the relics hum in her bones. Defend to be audited in daylight. Count say the number of lives before the fire. Before anything further could lock or jam, the meridian flinched. A spike of coherent microwave energy reached across space like a rough hand and squeezed. The compact ship had fired a warning lash across their comm cone, ugly and clumsy. Rios swore. A smell like hot coins crept into the air. Shield angle 2 points starboard, Mara said. Dump heat in short breaths. We don't shove, we lean. Acknowledged, Peregrine said, redirecting the ship's skin heat with a surgeon's patience. Their lash reflected off the ring yard ribs. Interference patterns are messy. Recommend we teach them their own wave. Mirror jurisprudence first, Aaliyah said. Broadcast their lash certificate. Peregrine projected it. The compact ship's own civil registry sent a squeal of signatures, a letter of caution filed at Cobalt Gate, a bond against damage, the exact terms under which their lash would be considered negligent if it struck recorded petitioners. Aaliyah tagged the Meridian as a petitioner and the anchorage as a silent witness. Mirror let their paper cut their hand. The lash hit the ring yard rib and came back in a tangle. The compact's quiet wells spiked, then chopped. They'd have to pay 4 zeros if it was found reckless, and the registry had all those zeros. Rios laughed once without humor. Their insurers just sat up in bed. Varhallan Aaliyah said sweetly back on the public hail, "Do you require a transcript?" Silence, then proceed to petition. They had won a small thing, without burning a larger thing. Mara exhaled. On her panel, the spindle showed a faint bar of light sliding from left to right and back again, like a tongue of cold. It was listening. Civilians in the Halcyon belt felt the shift. In a rusty canteen on Hab 9, a baker paused in dusting cinnamon on fried dough as the wall display ticked a warning code and then calmed. "It's the Navy," her cousin said, and the baker nodded and kept dusting. "If they wake it, they'll have to keep the books." On a family tug between ice stacks, a kid pressed his ear to the porthole and swore he heard a note threaded through the vacuum's silence, a single long vowel that tasted like snow metal. His mother told him not to romanticize machinery. He romanticized anyway. Teach use the quiet to make a lesson loud. They initiated the ritual the historian had guessed at. Not incense, not blood, not keys you could hold. Proofs. They opened the Meridian's reserves and offered data like an oath, procurement logs, rescue ledgers, hull cam footage of pulling a stranded miner out of a failing heat suit, release forms signed without thumbs pressing too hard. Aaliyah narrated. Peregrine curated. Mara stood and did not blink. "Why are we doing this?" Rios whispered. Not because he doubted, but because questions were part of good rituals. We could take a pry bar to its heart. Because we'll need to look back at ourselves after, Mara said. And because anything that old can make a lie permanent if we plant one in front of it. The sigil stroked itself brighter. The blue thinned to a color so close to white that it made the bridge seem dirtier than it was. A line of script unfolded along the hull of the spindle, then flaked away like frost, falling in a silence that felt ceremonial. Translation Peregrine said, but they already knew. Petition accepted. Aaliyah breathed. Rights provisional. Duty superior. Ledger take nothing you cannot account for. The anchorage woke like a courthouse opening its doors. Not with trumpets, not with soldiers, but with 100 small mechanisms, taking their stations' hatches that had not moved in eons, testing their hinges, vents, tasting the vacuum for fraud. The hum settled a half-tone lower, more comfortable on human bones. The scale sigil rotated once and stopped oriented toward the sun. A current went arcing through the ring yard, as if an invisible audit were circling, touching every rib, every vein, every cold urn. The Meridian's displays filled with vector maps, some ancient, some the AI's real-time calculations of how an attack might travel across space and where it would die if properly accounted. It was teaching, and it assumed they could count. Count if you cannot count, do not command. The compact ships are holding, Rios said, brow tightened. But we've got 3 looter skiffs unfurling nets from the far side of the ring. They didn't file anything with anybody. Peregrine Mara said, "What do we have that won't make holes, but will make points?" Decoy bloom in the ice waste, the AI said. Microwave sculpting through the ring ribs. If we map their lash to their own power returns, we can teach them a bill. Aaliyah nodded. Mirror them, then send the ledger to their banks. Careful, Mara said. We can turn their logic back without breaking their backs. Mirror returned the shot with the shape of its intent. They launched nothing that glowed. They threw a bouquet of cold into the belt. Tiny chaff packets shaped like scavenger signatures, each with a record in a neat line. The looters lashed at the decoys and watched as their beams reflected off the ring ribs in an old geometry. The coil that fed their engines tripped to safety, not because Peregrine hacked it, but because the anchorage's geometry made their lash look exactly like sabotage by their own hand. Insurers sent automatic notices. Contracts blinked red. Their pilots cursed and throttled down not in fear of death, but in fear of debt. 2 are retreating, Rios said, surprised. The 3rd is angry enough to be stupid. Let him be useful, Mara said. Peregrine record. The angry skiff charged. The anchorage shifted its heat in visible pulses that rolled along the ribs like breath across glass. The skiff's aim jittered toward the brightest pulse, then toward the next, then toward the next. It lunged at reflections it already owed before it understood. Tractor from Compact Rios said, "They do not want a corpse on today's spreadsheet." Aaliyah's mouth twisted. Sometimes they're good for something. Teach leave them a way to pay without bleeding. The first lawful act of the relic was simple and public. It sent a beam, not weapon bright, but ledger clean through the ring yard, intersecting the vector between the furious skiff and the brightest rib. At the point of intersection, the beam induced resonance at the frequency of the skiff's nav-comp's own emergency shutdown signal. The skiff drifted lights, soft engines safe. A bill of services printed itself into the Accord registry, and the compacts as well, a charge divided by 3, 1/3, to rescue 1/3, to restoration, 1/3 to the standing fund, for people who needed air but couldn't pay today. The Saint ship was awake, and it had a way it did things. Ledger public costs, public light. In Hab 9, the baker checked her screen as a new banner scrolled, Fund Credit %. She smiled without knowing why, just that her cousin's child would get a tank bypass replaced next week instead of next month. On the tug, the kid heard the vowel change and whispered to the window. Okay, I'll study the charts. On the meridian. Peregrine dimmed the bridge lights one notch as if the relic's logic demanded a calmer room. Varholland's face returned to the hollow jaw set. You awakened it, he said. You think you own the procedures. We obey them, Aaliyah said. Ownership isn't the right verb. Stand down your claim, Varholland said. The circuit has a doctrine for saint ships. They require collars. Collars, Mara asked, voice flat. Governance modules, locks. Humans love myth. We prefer chain. Name the chains before you break them. Mara could have reached for anger like a lever, but instead she counted. How many relics has your circuit collared, Inspector? 3, he said too quickly. How many kept their promises after? He did not answer. His eyes flicked to something off-screen, maybe a clerk, maybe a conscience. Aaliyah took the tenor down. Inspector, the Accord says collars are a last resort. Petitioners who can show teachable parity take stewardship. We're not here to crown ourselves. We're here to hold the book while it writes. We will file appeal at Cobalt Gate, Varholland said. File, Aaliyah said. We'll welcome scrutiny. In the meantime, you're welcome to witness and audit. Bring a clerk. Bring 10. The hollow cut. Mirror, let them see themselves in the glass you polish. The anchorage rotated a fraction, pointing a set of long, cold veins toward the pale sun. Heat danced along them like a new vocabulary, practicing its letters. Rios pushed the vector maps aside and replaced them with the relic's pulse signatures, color-coded, annotated with places where a lash would melt in its own echo. He looked like a man watching waves teach math to a beach. We have a window to the core, Peregrine said, and imaged the path. There is a chamber at heart center. Pressure, stable temperature at 190 Kelvin, air composition, not lethal but unwise. It is an archive, not shelves, weighted frames. Each frame is a case. We're going inside, Mara said, and Aaliyah nodded already throat-tight at the thought of the old law. Recommend Shore Team Bravo, Sergeant Pike said from the pit, the kind of man who used sentences like scaffolds. My people will bring the gentle tools. Gentle tools, Mara said with a quick smile. Good phrase. She turned to Peregrine. Keep teaching from out here. If the compact twitches, remind them what they signed. I can be very educational, Peregrine said. Teach enter as students instead of saviors. They crossed to the anchorage in a little shuttle that sounded like a kettle overboiling. The docking corridor was ribbed, each rib stamped with a set of tick marks, each set different. Counted vows. Aaliyah ran a gloved finger across them and felt the grooves like healed cuts. Mara kept her breathing steady and slow. The air smelled like old coins and clean stone. The archive chamber was not a cathedral, but a courtroom built for giants without giants' furniture. Frames hung from cables like scales, each frame holding a scroll of symbols that rearranged themselves when you looked twice. A slow wind moved not from fans, but from a temperature differential that felt intentional. At the center, a pedestal waited empty as an argument that wanted an opponent. Camera rolling, Pike said softly. Aaliyah stepped to the pedestal and set down a thin slab of crystal with the Accord badge etched in it, the same slab she used to swear in arbitrations. We bring a case, she said, and the frames shivered. One frame lowered, and words wrote themselves across its surface in a curl that became an alphabet they could read. The preamble was both short and enormous. Who carries the cost? Ledger name each debt so it cannot hide, Aaliyah began. She didn't tell a myth. She told receipts. How the Halcyon belt had been neglected until someone found pretty metal. How contracts were written with clauses that pretended to be choices. How the Accord had cut 612 bills in 2 years, so air would not be a luxury item. The frames listened like good jurors, and the sigils 9 tines around the chamber wall glowed one by one as if counting. Rios, circling the chamber with a sensor wand, paused at an engraved bar near the ceiling. Mara, he said, these arrays aren't just listening. They're scoring our proofs. There's a calibration line. If we lie, it'll ring out of tune. We don't lie, Mara said. Not even by accident, Rio said half to himself. He adjusted his calculations with care, trimming adjectives off his readouts as if they were burrs. Count hyperbole is a debt that comes due. The ritual was solved by the oldest trick in civilization, teaching in measurable terms and letting the student become a mirror. The frame that had asked who carries the cost changed its question. Who enforces the carrying? Not one, Aaliyah said. Not a collar. We spread it. We build audits you can read when we're gone. The frames shifted in a wave that cracked frost off a far corner like applause. Something like a line of music raised the hairs on Mara's arms. Pike's voice came quiet over the local channel. Ma'am, company. She turned. The compact had sent a clerk, after all, a small woman in a compact suit, with a pad hugged like a prayer book. Behind her, two skiffers in patched coats tried to stand like they'd come on purpose. They had the guilty faces of men who had fired at decoys and then read their bills. Inspector Var Holland's deputy, the clerk said, her voice careful. Deputy Air alone. We are here to witness and to lodge preliminary objections. Witness first, Aaliyah said. Objections that survive might teach us something. Mirror makes space for an objection so it can see itself. Deputy Lone approached the pedestal and read what had been written. Her breath caught at the frames like a singer hearing a better singer. Article 7.1, she said, the circuit doctrine on relics governing modules was enacted after the Halverston collapse. A saint ship took a city apart because it misread a crowd as a stampede. It did not ask questions. Then your doctrine answered the wrong thing, Aaliyah said. You collared its throat when its ears needed school. You will school an alien mind, Deputy Lone asked. Not contemptuous, curious. We will count with it, Aaliyah said. We will audit ourselves in front of it. Deputy Lone looked at the two skiffers. One lifted his chin. We came to steal, he said, which sounded better inside a court than it would have outside. They made us read our contracts. Then our engines coughed like we'd lied to them. Name, Aaliyah asked. Rax, he said. Juno, ma'am, the other added, awkward with the honorific. Rax Juno, Aaliyah said, you get to carry some weight now. We will show you how to pay it without drowning. Ledger let debt become a lesson, not a whip. The anchorage accepted their presence with a small easing of the air, as if the room had been holding a breath and chose to exhale. Mara watched as a new frame slid down this one blank glass clear. It reflected them, Mara, Aaliyah, Rios, Pike, Deputy Lone, Rax. Juno, 7 humans smaller than the room, but clear as a bad debt on a morning table. Peregrine whispered across the comm. Heat margin on the meridian is down 12% from the lash reflection. We can hold, but our radiators are working. Lieutenant Anders took a burn on his forearm when a coolant valve complained, but the medfoam is doing the right things. Cost recorded, Mara said, and hated that she liked the words. Count if you will not pay small costs, you will pay large ones. They carried back the first agreements like warm bread, temporary stewardship acknowledged by the anchorage, a standing fund codified on 3 registries, obligations for audits every 30 days. The compact's deputy signed as witness. The skiffers signed as bound but free, a phrase the frames had suggested without irony. On the bridge of the Meridian Var, Holland appeared again, eyes narrowed, mouth tight, and signed a provisional compliance letter because good inspectors loved their own procedures more than they loved winning. Then the anchorage offered them something none of them had expected, maps of heat, not as enemies saw it, but as law could shape it. It showed where the sun's faint breath could be pooled across veins, where a stray lash could be diffused with dignity, where a guilty ship might be caught without teeth. It was a set of precedents written in shadows. Each precedent is a map you walk with company. For 2 days, they walked it. Civilians were escorted along corridors where the new fund would first be spent. A corroded air circulator in Hab 14 sang like a kettle one last time, and then stopped. The baker cried, then laughed, then sold dough cheap. Rax and Juno presented themselves at a workshop, grimacing as they learned to calculate what a repaired engine saves across seasons. Deputy Lone remained with them, taking notes fast enough to squeak. It could have ended there, tidy as a well-thumbed ledger. It did not. The circuit of vigilance seldom accepted lessons with grace when pride was on the line. On the third day, 3 burn-bright signatures entered the belt sleeker than Var Holland's patrol and hungrier. They carried Doctrine modules like collars in boxes, 3 black rings with spikes of logic meant to sit around a Saint ship's core and tell it to obey. Rios's voice was steady. 3 incoming at 1.4 CEE. Profiles match circuit enforcers. Doctrine carriers verified. Peregrine breathed. We can intercept vectors across the ring ribs if we flip the incoming on their own approach shading, but the heat cost will be serious. We will sweat. Mara felt the relics hum like a purr against a nervous dog. We defend what we wake. But we do it measured. Aaliyah stood behind her chair like a second spine. Proclaim teaching before force. Mirror, announce your terms where even your enemies can hear. They hailed the enforcers. Approach is recognized, Aaliyah said. Doctrine carriers identified. By accord and compact provisional agreement relic stewardship is undergoing audit. Any attempt to collar without court risks sanctions, fines, and an embarrassing symposium. The enforcers did not respond with words. They responded with geometry, 3 approach cones that crossed to create a triangular cage at the anchorage's heart. Behind Aaliyah, Rax cursed low, and Juno grabbed his sleeve and squeezed. Deputy Lone closed her eyes for a second, then opened them wider. Peregrine, Mara said, show me the counters that turn Doctrine on itself. I propose a decoy of obligations, Peregrine said. We broadcast the fund's ledger as a heat map. Their Doctrine will recognize it as community essential infrastructure and auto-limit the allowable force vectors. They'll have to skirt their own terms. Rios blinked. You can shape their approach with their rules. We can ask their callers to be as lawful as their paperwork claims, Peregrine said, almost wry. Count box them with their own box. They projected the fund, hab by hab, child by child, air by cubic meter, onto the ribbed darkness of space as flickering squares of warmth. The enforcer ship's Doctrine modules pinged those squares, recognized them as protected by their own code, and shaved their cones down until the triangular cage became a hesitant hug. It would have been funny if it wasn't aimed at their ribs. Not enough, Rios said softly. They're still closing. The anchorage can do more, Deputy Lone said. If you ask in the right words. Aaliyah breathed in, then out. Obsidian anchorage, she said, stepping into the whisper channel. Teach us a mirror that does not break bones. The sigil flared. Along the ringyard panels unfurled that had not moved since something with 9 fingers signed the deck. Not weapons. Reflectors. They rotated, caught the pale sun, and held it without glare, bending its light along calculated paths. The enforcers' approach cones, already trimmed, met those paths and found themselves walking on invisible rails made of their own definitions of permissible force. Mirror, if they claim a rule, let them meet it. Heat margin dropping, Peregrine said. We are sweating through the paint. I recommend venting heat through the keel in staged breaths. We'll scar, but we'll keep the ribs cool. Do it, Mara said. We'll repaint. They vented in measures, and the Meridian's hull bloomed with scalloped discolorations, like old leaves pressed in a book. Lieutenant Anders' bandaged forearm strapped to his chest manned a valve and swore his way through a pain that would make good story later. The first cost was written in small scars. The second in a med log no one would make poetry out of. Ledger scars count as receipts. The enforcers hesitated when their Doctrine rang like a bell against the fund and the reflectors. One pushed anyway, then realized his own module had recorded 3 violations and would report him at the next court without needing a snitch. Another pushed and discovered his own ship had written itself a ticket. They stalled. The third adapted and angled for a vector, The Doctrine allowed a straight thrust that would encircle with a soft field and claim it was a temporary maintenance grip. "They're going for a grip that pretends to be maintenance," Rio said. Aaliyah swore for the first time all day. "They're good. They found a clause." Mara smiled without humor. "Then we find the clause that sits beside it." Deputy Lone spoke into the hush. Article 9.5, while maintenance grips are allowed, they must not impede an ongoing petition that includes community fund disbursement. If you can demonstrate a disbursement in progress, the doe, Mara said suddenly. HAB-9 circulator is still flagged as pending sign-off. Teach do not let them call it maintenance when it is control. They made the sign-off visible a single panel in HAB-9 green blinking, while the baker's cousin tightened a last screw. The enforcer ship's Doctrine flagged it and pulled the grip back of its own logic just 3 degrees enough to leave a lane open. 3 degrees was a window in space. Peregrine Mara said thread the meridian through that window and put our keel between their ring and the anchorage's spine. Pike didn't ask if it was safe. He put his hand on the back of Mara's chair and leaned as if the ship could feel a human body bracing and would take courage from it. Rios's plots unfurled like ribbons. Peregrine adjusted thrusters in half-breaths. They slid into the window. The enforcer's grip scraped their paint and kissed their belly with static. Every hair on Mara's arms lifted again. She tasted copper and cinnamon dust. "Count some windows last only as long as your courage," Commander Peregrine said softly. "We can hold this posture for 22 minutes before heat saturations force us to move. Recommend an appeal in the language they cannot ignore." Aaliyah was already drafting, eyes bright. "Symposium invitation," she murmured. "Public. Recorded. The anchorage as keynote. Title, On Precedent and Stewardship Without Collars." Deputy Lone laughed once, a shocked, delighted sound. "You will embarrass them into behaving. We will give them a way to save face they secretly want," Aaliyah said. "Var Holland will attend. He loves symposiums. Mirror offer them a mask they prefer to their own face." The invitation went out across the belt, and then along the cold arteries of the Accord and the circuit. The enforcers read it, fed it to their Doctrine modules, and slowed because the modules could not parse public symposium as a battle, and because men who lived on procedure often feared public laughter more than a beam. Mara leaned into the rail and let herself see the next hour, the next day. The anchorage would keep teaching. The meridian would keep sweating. The compact would keep arguing, and the court would love the argument like bread. On HAB-9, the baker watched the green panel go solid and clapped her hands, then hurried dough into oil, because people would come for celebration pastries, whether or not anyone declared a holiday. On the tug, the kid told his mother the vowel had changed again, and for a second she put her ear to the window and admitted, "Okay, fine, maybe it had." "Ledger, if you can hear it, you can count it," the enforcers answered at last. Var Holland's face returned, but older by a day. Lines around his mouth like parentheses around a phrase he'd learned to say. "Provisional stand-down," he announced, "pending symposium and court review. Doctrine modules will remain boxed and safed." "You did the right procedural thing," Aaliyah said. "There are more clauses than you know," he said, and it almost sounded like a compliment. "We're here to learn them," Mara said. The anchorage dimmed its panels 1 notch, and the sigils 9 times pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat you could set a ship to. The meridian's heat faded a little. The scars would stay, but the temperature would stop writing new ones for now. Anders laughed at a joke someone made about paint. Rax and Juno started arguing about whether to join the habitat repair crews as paid apprentices. Deputy Lone filed 3 forms at once and smiled while she did it. "Teach hold the door open while you fix the hinges." Commander Peregrine said there is a deeper chamber beneath the archive. "The path is not simple. It requests a proof I cannot provide alone." "What proof?" Mara asked. "A case without a claimant," Peregrine said. "A debt owed that no one has asked to collect. The anchorage will not open without one example." Aaliyah's breath caught. That's not law. That's mercy. It is law that remembers mercy, Peregrine said, almost fond. It teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. Mara looked at the map of the path and felt something settle inside her, something like a decision that had always been waiting. The conflict triangle on her shoulder, human moral line, AI calculus antagonist method, had resolved here for a second like a chord. Find me a case, she said. Find me a debt that no one thinks can be paid. Rios raised a hand like a student. There's a family on Hab 2 who never filed after their daughter's heat suit failed last winter. They sold her tools to cover the burial. They were too proud to send us a bill. Aaliyah's eyes went wet and bright, and she nodded like a judge who had waited years to speak a particular sentence. We will carry that one. Mirror, sometimes the glass shows you your own door. They gathered the receipts Rios had not been allowed to collect, yet the shop ledger with a blank space where a tool list had been the neighbor's statement, the maintenance logs that had been bent to look like they weren't to blame. They walked the proof back to the archive and set it on the pedestal like an offering that would make the room bigger or smaller forever. The frames tilted as if the room had leaned toward the case. The air slid from one shoulder to the other. The sigil's 9 tines glowed in an order Mara hadn't seen before. 7392, like the room counting in a language invented to tell stories you couldn't tell any other way. The pedestal sank 1/2 meter. Beneath it, a stair spiraled down, carved not by hands, but by repetition, like water had learned to be a blade. Cold air rose clean and bitter with the smell of old metal, and something like distant pages turning came with it. Count go down when the law asks you to. Mara gestured to Pike, who gestured to his team, who checked lines and lights without fuss. Aaliyah straightened her gray suit and laughed under her breath at the absurdity of dressing for court to walk into a saintship's heart. Rios checked his band and kissed his thumb and pressed it to the sigil embossed on the stair as a private superstition. Deputy Lone came with them uninvited and unrefused. Rax and Juno stayed at the top, eyes wide like boys at the mouth of a cave where the wind told older jokes. They descended. The room below was warmer by a precise number of degrees that made breath feel square. Shelves, no slots, held blocks of transparent material with faint smoke inside, as if 100,000 candles had breathed and then been told to hold still. Each block had a label that wasn't a word, wasn't a number, wasn't any alphabet they knew. And yet when Aaliyah's eyes slid across one, she knew it meant a settlement reached before a war could feel inevitable. Peregrine's voice was quiet, not because its speakers couldn't be louder, but because loud would be wrong. This is the ledger that remembers what paid what. It is not money. It is weight. Find the empty place, Mara said. Find the weight that is waiting. They turned down a corridor that did not care about their orientation. The empty place found them. It looked like a shelf that had never been built. Aaliyah took the receipts for the girl from Hab 2, slid them into a slot that didn't exist until she decided it did, and the room sighed. Teach the weights do not vanish, they become bearable. A low tone drifted up the stair, up to the archive, up to the docking tube, up to the meridian, where Anders held his bandaged forearm up to the light, up to Hab 9, where the baker flipped dough, up to the tug where the kid leaned his head against the window and said, "Yes, that's the one." Mara felt the tone in her marrow. It made a promise. It did not name the shape of the promise, but it laid the scale on the table. A faint light began beneath the empty slot, a little pulse like a heartbeat under a shirt, and the room flushed not brighter, but more honest. Ledger, the first entry, is always the heaviest. Mara turned to Aaliyah. We keep going, she said. We keep paying the debts no one thinks need receipts, and we make sure they have receipts. Aaliyah nodded, eyes shining with something more durable than triumph. And when they come back with collars, we show them a book that bites. Peregrine breathed, because breathing is what you do when the room asks for patience. The stair behind them shifted slightly, as if more steps had learned they were steps. They climbed back toward the archive, toward the arguments and the symposium, and the enforcers who would find new clauses to weaponize. Mara put a hand on the rail and felt the hum steady to a rhythm she could count. Count, hold the rhythm while the world learns the song. They emerged to a bridge washed in sunrise colors. The pale dwarf had rolled along its little arc and thrown white onto the ring ribs like paper spread on a desk. Rax and Juno stood straighter when they saw Mara's face. Deputy Lone took a long breath like a woman who had remembered why she studied procedure. Anders flexed his bandaged arm and grinned to show he would keep moving. Mirror let the room see what it helped you become. The symposium assembled faster than anyone expected. The belt loves a public quarrel when the consequences are edible. Habs streamed signatures. 2 circuit scholars in stiff coats took seats with polite frowns like boys at a funeral cake. Var Holland's feed registered early a square of his face lit by the cool light of a clerk's desk. The anchorage set a slow pulse under everything, an even metronome that made the bridge crew's voices fall into measured cadences without trying. We convene under Article 2 for shared interest. Aaliyah said just enough rasp to make authority sound lived in. Claimants present. Witnesses present. Subject stewardship of the Obsidian Anchorage. Doctrines at issue collars versus audits. We will keep to receipts. We will keep to costs. A quiet settled that did not feel like fear. On the console, the symposium agenda scrolled without flourish: petitions, demonstrations, precedent, vote record. Count, write the order before the passions arrive. The first demonstration began with a bowl of heat. Peregrine projected it as a shallow curve in space the pale sun poured into a controlled dish. We propose baseline stewardship practices, the AI said, voice as plain as a ledger line. Heat pooling to cushion shocks. Reflection geometry to discourage illegal approaches. Teaching functions at the rib scale open to audit. An enforcer captain leaned into his camera. You will let a warship teach civilians. Peregrine answered before Aaliyah could, and its answer surprised Mara even though she had asked it to be bold. Correction. We will let civilians teach a saintship, and the saintship will teach back. If either refuses to be taught, stewardship fails. Teach. If you do not learn, you do not lead. They showed the mirror gambit again, this time annotated with the doctrine clauses that had bent before their own wording. There was laughter at points, good laughter, the kind that slips between anger's ribs and steals its air. The baker on Hab 9 raised a tray in the background of her feed, and everyone forgot to be solemn for 3 seconds when a kid stole a twist and burned his fingers. Varholland did not laugh. He spoke when the charts ended. You assume good faith from bad actors, he said. You assume precedent is a leash. It is not. It is a path the wolves learn. We assume wolves can raid, Aaliyah said. And that public light makes bad hunting. The second demonstration was not geometry. It was the empty case they had carried downstairs and filled. Aaliyah did not say the girl's name. She said the hours. She said the temperature. She said the price of the tool set and the number of days the family cooked on coils because they would not risk the friend's stove. The frame above the pedestal tilted, and the faint smoke in the ledger block they had nudged into being swirled like breath. Ledger let a single life set the scale for 1,000. Deputy Lone spoke next. Circuit doctrine was born in fear and a hurry, she said, not looking at Var Holland as she said it. It has prevented 3 disasters and caused 4 avoidable harms. We choose collars because we fear humility, not because it always works. We urge this court to test one belt where stewardship is counted not by the hardness of chains, but by the thickness of the records. You are a deputy, Var Holland said, even but sharp. Your mandate is observation. My mandate is truth, she said. I observed it. Rios glanced at Mara and mouthed good witness. She didn't hide her smile. Mirror turn a title into a tool by speaking straight. The enforcers did not stay quiet. The captain who had argued earlier showed a neat diagram labeled Lie Risk, a curve that rose sharply when saints awakened. He did not shout. He explained. His caution came honest from cities he'd kept steady. The curve was compelling until Peregrine overlaid a second curve labeled Receipt Risk without fanfare. The second curve fell when ledgers rose. We can be lied to, Peregrine said. Callers help you when you cannot afford to be lied to at all. Audits help you when you choose to grow up. The captain's mouth twitched, like a man grateful for a decent adversary. Teach put their strongest point next to your own, then count. Costs arrived like friends late to awake. Peregrine itemized the Meridian's heat scars. Anders's burn became 3 words in a line. The decoy bloom that had drifted into the ice waste was marked as a loss with a small square and no elegy. Aaliyah read the bill for the skiffers who had fired at ghosts. Rax and Juno stood up behind her and did not flinch as their names went public. We pay it, Rax said. We'll work at Hab 14's shop. They said we could start tomorrow. Juno held up a grease-stained palm as if pledging. He looked ridiculous and good. Count public costs make private shame become public honor. The vote did not come then because the belt does not fling stamps as if they were coins into a parade. There was a challenge. A voice crackled from a feed with a screaming background tone. It belonged to a man in a helmet with old saints etched across it, a cultist from a Hab no official had visited since the Slack Moat's plague. You woke our guardian, he said. You sit in its court and count with disrespect. It chose us first. Aaliyah did not smirk. She did not breathe toward contempt. Show your choosing, she said. He held up a ring of dented metal and kissed it. The anchorage did not light. The frames did not tilt. The scale sigil did not turn. It was a private ceremony in a public room, and the room had no patience for it. We have food for 40 families, he said, eyes fierce. We call that law. Show your ledger, Aaliyah said again softer. He hesitated. He could not. His story was love and hunger written on faces. The anchorage required numbers. It did not mock him. It simply didn't answer. He left the feed up and did not speak again. Mirror let the unsubstantiated claim shine until it dims itself. The enforcers, to their credit, did not use the cultist's appearance to argue for callers. Varholland cleared his throat and performed his function like a man doing arithmetic on a long night. Motion, he said. Temporary stewardship by Meridian under accord, audit for 1 belt year. Doctrine modules to remain boxed. Circuit to be granted inspection rights of teaching functions. Precedent to be named if we do not all die. The baker's kid cheered on a channel where he should not have been. Everyone forgave him. Aaliyah turned to Mara. You carry it, she said simply. You asked for the burden sworn. Mara had known it was coming, and it still felt like being asked to hold a sleeping child on a long walk. We carry it, she said. We count. We answer questions. We make heat gentle. Ledger stewardship is a verb with tired feet. They named the precedent in a room that still smelled faintly of cool metal and human breath. Not the anchorage precedent that sounded too much like story and not enough like policy. They called it the Halcyon Stewardship Standard, and everyone nodded because it was boring in a way that would get printed on forms. It had 4 paragraphs and 2 footnotes and an annex that would grow like a careful vine. Then came the second escalation, quiet and personal. The anchorage had given maps of heat. It had not given maps of hearts. In the night cycle, Peregrine woke Mara with a tone that was polite even at 0300. Commander, it said the cultist feed's origin hab is venting slow. A gasket. I would not have trusted in a kettle failed. 24 souls. No petition filed. Pride is a poor radio. Mara swung her legs over the bunk, the deck cool under her bare feet. Wake Aaliyah. Wake Pike. Wake the shop in 14. I want a line of volunteers before my boots are warm. They went with tools and blankets. No weapons. Rax and Juno came without needing to be asked. Deputy Lone brought a chute of parts and a manual printed before she was born. The corridor to the venting hab was white with frost that made hair stiff. A smell like a penny held too long in the mouth mingled with the sweet stink of old tins opened in a hurry. "We got you," Pike said through his mask voice, steady, stepping into a cramped hall, where a woman held a baby under a heat hood that coughed. Teach answer sovereignty with soup and wrenches. Peregrine lit their path in pulses that did not blind. The anchorage held the pressure steady, like a god pinching the top of a bag. The gasket was not heroic. It was a ring of pliable matter that had become a ring of brittle matter, and it wanted to be replaced without ceremony. Juno's hands shook. Rax put his forehead against the pipe and breathed until it stopped fogging, then moved. Deputy Lone read out torque values like scripture. They sealed the leak. They sealed two more that hadn't screamed yet. No one took a bow. The cultist who had shouted at the symposium sat with his back against the wall and watched his child breathe, and then he set the dented ring down without kissing it. He did not join the accord. He did not abandon his saints. He said hoarsely, "We will keep a book." Aaliyah handed him a blank ledger. "Start with today," she said. "You owe us soup. Mirror let pride pay in hospitality until it can pay in coin." They slept 3 hours and woke to the third escalation. The circuit's scholars filed an injunction at Cobalt Gate. Not a collar order more dangerous, a demand for control of the anchorage's teaching functions, until the symposium's transcript could be reviewed for procedural integrity. It would freeze the fund. It would stall repairs. It would make the belt taste waiting again. Aaliyah paced the bridge with a stiffness that meant rage had a leash around its neck. "They are not wrong to want integrity," she said. "They are wrong to ignore oxygen to get it." "Options," Mara said. "I can file a counter-motion," Aaliyah said. "We can argue necessity and the doctrine of continuing relief. It might take weeks. We do not have weeks where air is concerned." Peregrine cleared its throat, an affectation Aaliyah had given it once as a joke, and which now settled serious talk. "There is a clause buried in circuit filings for emergency pedagogy deployments. If an audit class exceeds a set size and is in session, teaching functions cannot be paused without a supermajority of the court." Mara blinked. "We can hold class. We can teach the court," Peregrine said. "If they enroll. Count when delay is a weapon, turn learning into a shield." They announced the class like a party for frightened adults. Title heat, debt, and grace. The anchorage opened rib rooms to hold 500, then 1,000, then 10,000, where feeds overflowed into halls, kitchens, repair bays. Circuit scholars logged in with tight faces and inadvertently became students when their forms asked them to pick a seat. Aaliyah began with numbers anyone could touch. She held up a coil and a calculator and let a child from Hab 9 punch in the figures to show what a 20% efficiency gain buys in bread. Peregrine ran a simulation where every lie in a petition burned a tiny square on the map for a day. No one chose to lie in front of their neighbors. Rax and Juno taught a segment on shame and how to make it useful. Deputy Lone taught the footnote about interim relief like a woman confessing and being forgiven by law itself. Teach, if you do not trust a court, turn it into a class until it does better. Var Holland attended in a quiet tile with his video off. He answered questions in text with a courtesy that could not be faked on 4 hours of sleep. The enforcer captain admitted in a breakout that Doctrine modules resent sloppy statutes. A grandmother on Hab 2 told the class in a trembling voice about the weight under the ledger block where her granddaughter's tools used to be, and then she smiled, because she had a place to point her grief now. The injunction did not vanish. It changed shape. The court looked at the attendance and realized it had enrolled. To stop teaching would require them to vote against their own presence. They delayed the injunction under a phrase so elegant it might have been a prayer continuance for pedagogical absorption. The fund remained liquid. The anchorage's panels kept their shallow breaths. The belt exhaled as one organism finding it still had lungs. Ledger, sometimes the signature is 10,000 names watching together. It should have simply rolled into work after that. Instead, Peregrine brought Mara a problem shaped like a knife she could not grasp without bleeding. The anchorage had calculated that if they pulsed a heat cycle through a set of ribs, now they could harden the ring yard against a flare predicted for next month. It would be a gift to the future bought with sweat today. The cost would be steep, all non-essential habs dark for 3 hours, food spoiled in 100 fridges, tempers roused in 1,000 kitchens. Moral calculus, Peregrine said. I can compute the numbers. I cannot carry the anger. That is a human load. Mara stood at the viewport where Frost had sketched invisible maps on the glass. If we don't pulse, the flare will peel plates and kill 3 maintenance crews who won't move fast enough. If we do pulse, we hurt now. Aaliyah rubbed her temples with the base of her palms. Transparency. Consent where possible. Relief more than apology. The standard says we count before we decide. We publish our numbers. We publish our faces. Mirror make decision in a room with the people who will pay it. They told the belt the truth. They showed the flare forecast, the expected saving the certain costs. The chat filled with salt and sugar. A man cursed them and then offered his generator. A woman demanded compensation and then volunteered to check on elders. Kids begged to help because kids love being necessary. The vote came narrow but firm. 71% said pulse. 29% cursed and then made soup. They pulsed. The anchorage thrummed like a choir that has learned a harder harmony. The ribs glowed a color almost human eyes cannot name somewhere between clean steam and polished steel in sunlight. The meridian sweated its last clean paint into memory. Anders curled his fingers and grimaced as his bandage pulled. The baker lost dough and fed the ruined batch to goats who did not care about texture and wagged their tails like solved equations. Count pay publicly. Comfort publicly. Move on to the work that requires you. An hour into the dark, the cultist from the venting hab arrived at Hab 9 with a pot under his arm. He had exchanged the dented ring for a wrench in his belt. Soup, he said to anyone and everyone. Ledger says we owed it. 3 days later, the flare rolled like a lion's cough across the belt. It came mean and quick and found the ribs hard as rules written clearly. It peeled nothing. It killed no one. The court added a line to the standard that tasted of relief on the tongue. Emergency pulses approved by public vote satisfy both necessity and dignity. Mirror win with their voices, and you will not need to win with yours. You could feel the end near then, not because the work was done, but because the story had taught what it needed to and wanted to become a life. Varholland sent a message with no flourish. I rescind my objection to temporary stewardship, he wrote. I reserve the right to be a nuisance. Aaliyah replied with a smile no archive could record, please do. The enforcer captain wrote an article titled, On Doctrine and Kitchens, and it went viral in places where virality involved chalk. The cultist joined a repair crew and learned to love torque values like psalms. Rax and Juno discovered that honest sweat makes a man taller without changing his height. Peregrine, not given to poetry, began saving a few frames of raw background, hum each day like memory stones, and labeled them with names of small victories. Gasket fine dough, risen paint scar, Anders grin. Ledger remember the small things or you will think only in catastrophes. There remained one last argument to settle, and it came from inside the Meridian. A junior officer submitted an anonymous note through the council channel. We woke a god and made it a clerk. Is that not a kind of killing? It struck Mara harder than an injunction. She called a small room meeting with Aaliyah and Peregrine because some questions must be answered face to face, even with machines. We did not make it a clerk, Aaliyah said, voice gentle as if speaking to a bruise. We let it be what it already was, a scale that remembers. We asked it to weigh us. We asked it to show its math. And if it wanted to be a god, the anonymous voice said through the intercom. Peregrine answered with no wit. Then it would lie. Gods lie because they choose themselves over truth. Clerks who love their work do not. Mirror, if you call it God, it will stop letting you argue. Mara sent the anonymous officer the ledger block with the faint smoke still swirling from the girl's case with a note. Come hold this with me. He came. He held. He cried without shame. He requested extra shifts teaching kids how to read heat graphs and wrote his name on a volunteer list no one had to see to matter. The standard went to Cobalt Gate in a packet trimmed of rhetoric and heavy with receipts. The court stamped it with a satisfaction few had seen since the storm years. It read, in part, relics bearing adjudicatory marks shall be engaged by proofs. Stewardship shall be temporary, audited, and public. Callers shall be last resort upon repeated recorded failure of instruction. Someone chiseled the last sentence into a brass plate and bolted it to a wall in Hab 14, where grease and laughter could find it. Teach if it isn't on a wall somewhere, it isn't law yet. The anchorage dimmed the ring yard lights to a soft pulse that matched the common room heartbeat. The sigil rotated once, then found true. The frames in the archive rearranged themselves by a degree no one but Aaliyah noticed, and she said nothing, because not every noticed thing earns words. They held a closing session that was not called that, because closure is for books, not belts. Mara spoke 12 sentences. Aaliyah spoke 13. Peregrine spoke one that landed like a hand on a doorframe after a long day. Deputy Lone read an addendum that made Var Holland smile in a way that made his face look younger. Rax and Juno did not speak. They held up their apprentice badges and grinned. Mara walked the rib path one last time before sleep boots ringing on metal that had been cold for centuries and now held a low, steady warmth you could imagine recognizing by touch. She ran her fingers along the etched tick marks and thought not for the first time about what it means to carry something that can outlive your laugh and your grief. She paused at a viewport and watched the belt tick. The pale dwarf sipped heat. The ribs shone. Hab lights flickered with the randomness of 1,000 separate dinners, coalescing into a pattern too big and too kind for algorithms to do more than admire. Count if the map looks like a heartbeat, you are doing it right. At last, she returned to the archive for the ending that would not be an ending. She placed her palm on the pedestal. The sigils 9 tines lit one by one and stayed lit. A ledger block near the center blinked once a small square, changing from faint smoke to steady cloud. Along the ring yard arrays cooled in slow exhalations that looked like breath on a winter morning. She spoke quietly, almost to herself, almost to the ship, and the room chose to make a record of it. We woke a teacher when others wanted a throne. We learned that ledgers can be merciful without becoming soft, and that mercy can be measurable without becoming cruel. We bent weapons with words written in other people's hands, and we wrote our own names small in the corners of very large pages. If we are worth anything, it will be because we kept counting when counting was boring, and we told the truth when a lie could have made the day easier. This belt will forget our faces and keep our forms. That is the point. If the next war wants a collar, it will have to argue with a wall and a soup kitchen and a gasket that didn't fail. We leave the saint ship with a standard and take the weight that makes us worth its trust.